And we are live. And welcome to the next episode. I believe it's already number 10 of That's Connected Musings, where I'm meeting and talking and have very interesting deep conversations with people that I encountered during my work as a presenter and promoter of cultural events in Philadelphia. And this lovely lady who's across me from the screen is was my, I would say, godmother in cultural events, in cultural development, because of her kindness and her help. My organization was able to move from one-off grants to being sustained, have a little more sustained financing. So it's a separate story, and we became friends, personal friends. She came to my birthday, and we talked a lot on the phone. And we this year we actually found ourselves together fighting for arts and culture in Philadelphia, that we're gonna talk about a little bit later. But before now, I would like to introduce you, Michelle Kurika. Am I pronouncing you correct? Okay, great. And just giving you a little heads up, we started the conversation, and I was looking at the painting behind Michelle, and she started to talk about this, and I thought, no, please tell it to everybody. Tell it to everybody. So, stage is yours.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for having me on. I've actually watched some of the other interviews, and there've been some really interesting conversations
Thank you.
that you've been having with people. So thank you again for inviting me to be here. The image in the back was actually, I think, created by an artist here in Philadelphia. And the first time I saw it, it made me think of a folk story that I learned as a new immigrant to the United States. So my family immigrated from Guyana, Georgetown, Guyana in South America to the US in 1990. Okay. And I'm a product of public schools. And so in public schools, we had language arts. And one of the stories we read was a folktale called The People Could Fly. And it was about how when we were still on the continent, Africans knew magic. But when the slave trade caused us to cross the Atlantic, some of us had to leave the magic behind, had to leave some of the power behind, but some still practiced. And so when we came to the Americas and some of us were in the fields, the newer generations didn't know the magic. And so those that were the elders would teach the young who were, exhausted from the heat or exhausted from the overwork, or to save their lives from an overseer who may have tried to brutalize them, would teach them the magic words to help them fly. I do not see a separation between that story of enslavement and what is being experienced by undocumented workers in the fields. We talk about essential workers, and our food system would not have survived during the pandemic without people being, working in the fields. And so the images behind me are actually of migrant workers. And that struck me the first time I saw it, that we're all connected and that we can't separate these kinds of things.
Michelle, when you were talking about this, I had my cultural wheels turning in my head. And, I'm Jewish, right? I'm Jewish by origin, from Russia. And we had, I don't know if you know, the famous painter, Marc Chagall.
Yes, Marc Chagall, yes.
Marc Chagall, he is painting exactly the same way, flying people.
Wow.
People fly, magical people flying across the skies and, embracing each other. So looks like this motive of people, of magic and people that can fly is very close to all the oppressed people.
There are definitely stories about, the story of Jewish people coming out of bondage that I definitely can see linked to the story of the African slave trade, to to migrant workers, undocumented workers, but also to the people that are enslaved still today, not just within those populations that we talk about. But I learned about Marc Chagall while I was in Japan, actually, and learned a bit about his work, a lot of the elements and the imagery that he repeated in a lot of his art. The aspect of magic I did not know, but was able to see his work again at the Barnes collection when I finally moved to Philadelphia. So I like that connection.
Sure. So you came from British Guyana.
Well, when I was born, it was no longer British Guyana, but yes.
Okay,
Guyana
because I just learned before our conversation, I've heard the word Guyana, but I was a little bit surprised finding there so many Guyanas.
That's right. So
5 of them, right?
There are 3 of them currently. The Guyana is basically the highlands, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it would be the area that is northeastern South America.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if Venezuela was considered part of the Guyanas.
Actually, as far as I remember, one of the areas of Venezuela is considered a Guyana. It reminds me situation with Kurds in Afghanistan, in Iraq, that are like in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Same story: Dutch Guyana, French Guyana, Brazil
Dutch
Guyana,
yes.
Venezuelan Guyana, and Suriname.
That's right. So Suriname is Dutch Guyana.
Yeah,
French
Dutch.
Guyana is still French Guyana. Guyana, which is now the Republic of Guyana, was British Guyana. But the term themselves, so there are some places in Venezuela that do have similar namings to Guyana. So Guyana was a colony, well, it was occupied by the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British.
Right.
So those cultures are definitely still seen either in the architecture and the food, in some of the Creolese language, which is like the Pidgin English that the locals speak. But yes, right now there are 3 Guyanas, but it really just does mean, I believe, the highlands. And Guyana is the land of many waters.
Right. So, but you originated from what is now Republic of Guyana.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. I was born there.
Okay. And you immigrated. Your family immigrated to the United States when you were what, 6 years old?
6 years old.
Okay, I remember but then how did you end up in Japan?
I told my parents when I was 12, I was going to visit Spain, travel around New Zealand, go to Japan and have a Japanese boyfriend.
Wow.
All of those things.
What a desire for a 12 years old. You're going places now. What can I say?
You got to speak things into being. So, it ended up happening. After my first year in college, I was walking through the student center and I found out about the JET program, which is the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program.
Okay.
And at the time I was too young. You had to be a graduated senior student in order to be considered for the program. So I remembered them. And when I was in my second semester of undergrad, I applied and I was accepted. And the plan was to only go for 2 years. But while I was there, the Great Recession hit. And everyone was like, don't come back, don't come back, don't come back just yet. And so I ended up staying an additional 3 years.
Wow.
I think the recession happened in 2009.
Right.
So yeah, I didn't come back 2008, right? So I didn't come back until 2011. And next month, well, whenever this airs, I will be in Philadelphia for 10 years.
Okay. I remember when you first actually appeared in the Cultural Fund. You were so energetic, so friendly and stuff. But let's get back to your Japanese experience. So I understand in Japan you get hooked up on Aikido.
Well, no.
And for me, I was just thinking, for me, it's a kind of have a special connection because when my son was like 7, 8 years old, when we just came to the United States, his first sport was Aikido. So he was learning, he got like maybe to the yellow belt, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, we still have his costumes actually laying around somewhere in the attic.
So I didn't actually learn of Aikido until I moved to Philadelphia, but Aikido had been so close to my life for years and I didn't know. So when I went to college, there was a famous teacher who was actually down the block from my school, didn't know, lived in Japan for 5 years. I did traditional Japanese drumming. So I did that for the 5 years that I was there. And by the time I left, I had the equivalent of a black belt. But I did not begin Aikido until March of 2013. So it was Philadelphia and my desire to maintain contact with Japanese culture that, and the fact that Aikido is a defensive martial art, it's the art of peace. The premise is that anyone that wants to intentionally harm another person is not well. They're unbalanced. They are in pain. They are hurting. And so as a practitioner of the art, my job is to heal, to subdue, and pain or injury or hopefully not death only happens if the person maintains their attack, if the person increases their intensity. So to protect other people around, not just myself, I also increase my intensity in my response to subdue. But it is it's essentially the art of peace. Right. We don't want to bring harm to others.
I remember very well this part. I was really impressed. So, and I understand you are part of establishing Aikido Institute here.
That's right. So our work was to build a world-class martial arts dojo, which was going to be led by Donovan Waite, who pretty much was a lifelong practitioner. But this February, 2021, he actually died. And so right now we are in the process of memorializing him. A few students we want to have an actual memorial where we can gather and mourn him because he died during the coronavirus, not from coronavirus itself, but we weren't able to gather and mourn together due to safety. And so we're in the process of hosting a memorial for him in September, but because of the Delta variant, we may have to postpone it until November. And the goal is to maintain his legacy by at least having an annual seminar, because we were building the school because of the work that he had done to elevate the practice, to actually evolve the practice, especially the practice of what we call ukemi. I have a friend that may want to make an appearance. Oh, he may not want to make an appearance, a little cat.
Okay.
And so
that's fine. I close the door so my cat won't interfere. She's always interfering in my wife's meetings. Yeah, it's it's a given.
Yes. So it was a very, very, very intense loss for me. And not just me, I'm one of his younger students. There are people who have been studying with him for like 30, 40 years. Right. He himself, I think, was only about 64, 65. And so he'd been practicing Aikido for over 50 years, almost his entire life. And so he had people learning from him and watching him evolve and growing in their practice with him for like 40 something years. So my loss feels monumental, but I know that it's deeper for people all over the world, actually.
I understand. Okay, but so hopefully this movement and this connections, this group of people, group of students, the schools that he built in Philadelphia will help to alleviate this violence that happens in Philadelphia a lot. But the second big part of dealing with this problem should be arts and cultures that we both been involved for so long. So can you tell me, how did you end up in Cultural Fund?
How did I end up at the Cultural Fund? So I wanted to move to Philadelphia because after having spent 5 years in Japan, there were definitely some characteristics about the next place I wanted to go to. I didn't have a choice about where I was sent. I ended up loving it, but I ended up in my town in Japan because I was a female, North American, and I had a driver's license. That's how I ended up
That's
in my
interesting, the
place.
combination.
I wanted a bit more of a deliberate purpose for being in, the next place that I wanted to go to. So I did a search for a city that had a large immigrant population. That was very important to me. I was curious about being in the North, having grown up in the South. I wanted to have a different experience of America, right? I wanted to be close enough to family and just far enough away that I had independence, but I could quickly get to family, or I could quickly clean the house before somebody came to visit, Arts and culture were a major reason that I moved to Philadelphia. While I was in Japan, just to go to our state museum, the museum in our capital city, I'd have to drive an hour and 45 minutes.
Wow.
I'd have to pay for parking. If I wanted to go to a national museum, one that was, really well known, or even a world-class museum, I'd have to drive an hour and 45 minutes to the city, jump on a plane, rent a hotel, or, find a friend that would pick me up, right? Just to see a world-class museum. So imagine to be walking distance from several world-class institutions, right? That put Philly on the top of my list. And as I mentioned earlier, I did Japanese drumming and I was really good at it. So I knew that there was a wadaiko group, a taiko group in Philadelphia. And so I reached out and asked if I could join. And one of the leaders of the taiko group was June O'Neill. And June O'Neill at that time was the leader of the Philadelphia Cultural Fund.
I remember her, yes.
So I moved. One of the top reasons I moved to Philadelphia was because of the large immigrant population. And that's actually the work that I wanted to do. I understood that when new immigrants or refugees or asylees come over, it often happened to be families or men that got the support they needed first, right? I may be wrong, but what I was learning in the research that I was doing, and I wanted to be helpful, having a background in Spanish, having a background in Japanese. There aren't that many Japanese, refugees, but understanding the needs. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh had some of the highest populations of refugee serving organizations. And so I ended up interning for this organization called La Puerta Abierta, which worked with undocumented teenagers who were just now finding out they were undocumented. They thought they were American citizens their whole life until it was time to get a driver's license. They were applying to really great schools and they needed like their birth certificate or their social security number. They were valedictorians of their schools. And then when they found out, the psychological stress, feelings of shame would really demoralize or even debilitate some of these students. And so this organization was creating a pathway of networking for them to actually have therapy, to talk about this, but also provide information about what the alternatives were, right? And this is before the Dreamers program was created.
Okay.
So La Puerta Abierta and the Cultural Fund happened to share offices. And I would be in there every Wednesday doing the intern thing, like working the social media, moving things, moving boxes, like creating manuals. And sometimes the Cultural Fund needed help, right? Like they'd need help moving things, or if they had an event, they need extra hands. And there was a point in time where the previous executive assistant, was going to relocate. She was going to move. And June remembered me and called me in for an interview. and I think I did a good job. And so I ended up joining the cultural fund that way. So we had different kinds of overlaps.
Interesting, yeah. So it's always an interesting story how people ended up in the places where they ended up. And I understand you've been this cultural fund for what, 8, 7, 9 years?
So from 2013 until February 2013 to January 2020. So almost 7 years.
Almost 7 years, right. So, and during the 7 years, you had a chance to work with probably majority of small and mid-sized organizations in Philadelphia.
That's right.
So you probably understand better than anybody else what they need and how they feel and what values they present and they do for the city, what they have for the city.
The values of what they do, I think the organizations are the best at saying what they need. And I think my job was, if it wasn't clear, to help them better articulate that story. Because you, the arts organizations, are your best storytellers, and the people who come through your programs can speak to the power of what you do. And so for me, I felt like I was this like secret agent who was like doing the work of making sure that that story got told, right? Making sure that that money could finally get to like the organizations that needed it, the small ones, right? The groups that are out there making differences. Not that the big groups don't, but they've got the systems and the departments and the donors and the endowments. And it's like the smaller groups that like I was so motivated by. And you're right, it's their values. Like that always drew me towards the smaller organization.
Right. One of the things I'm working on a big project right now that I hope to present in the next maybe week or so. But related to this small arts organizations and how to advance them in our city and maybe around the United States. But as a part of my research, I read a dissertation research of Chinese scientists, Chinese American scientists back from 2014. That was specifically about small arts organizations. So they constitute, her research, about 83% of all arts organizations in her research. But what kind of struck me, and I need to read it a little bit more, that because they're so small, they're small and nimble, they don't afraid to innovate.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Big organizations, they always need to worry about making sure that they have patrons, that they satisfy donors, they satisfy boards, they satisfy, again, nothing against it. It just helps to raise money and create beautiful works of art. But a lot of real innovation happens on this level. On the level of small organizations.
I do agree with that. Just the idea of fiscal sponsorship, right? Like smaller organizations are so focused on their product, so focused on making the connections to the people that they're serving, the artists that they are serving, the platforms that they're providing, that in order for them to focus on that, to be able to have a partnership like a fiscal sponsor, a more established organization that understands the maintenance of a 501c3, understands the compliance that's required, has the cash to be able to, keep all the wheels turning, and then also be a partner to allow a small group like that to get charitable funds, but also like share knowledge with them that could either connect them to other peers. That is a form of innovation that started with small institutions, right? Being able to look at what happened in the pandemic and all those really individual artists and small groups that went online immediately.
Yeah.
They led the way.
In fact, I just received today a confirmation that things that we did during the pandemic actually resulted in a very interesting collaboration, a very interesting product. We had an event in February of this year. We had an event that called, and it was a marathon of culture. When musicians are speaking, world is quiet. So we were gathering artists around the world, from around the world in virtual performances, short videos, maybe 2, 3, 5 minutes. One was probably around 20, but who made those work of arts to make sure that people stop talking about politics, stop sharing all the stupid ideas about, left, right, top, bottom, whatever. It just listen to music, to poetry, dance, and stuff like that. So decompress just for one day. So we had artists performing from Italy, from Greece, from Albania, from England, from Ukraine, some Canada, United States, several. So and then at the end, we had like a Zoom meeting, and mostly people from abroad came around.
Wow.
And two of the most popular was a poet who was, she's Russian by origin, but she lives in Italy right now. And her poetry is now being translated to Italian, translated to English. And she just published her first book, becoming incredibly popular. And then American dancer who also lived in Italy, and she was doing a dance based on music, on music and specific and imagery. It's like a beautiful video. And they met at this event. They talked, they introduced each other, and they connected. And today is actually a premiere of their work.
Wow.
Yes, I just
seeing international collaborations.
Yes.
In a moment of global just chaos, the arts.
Yes, it's
exactly the connection.
It's exactly what happens, and I'll be honest with you, I was really proud when they tagged me in a Facebook post, and I kind of felt that we did something right. So and let's move to the a little bit extending our meeting, not just half an hour, because we still have a very important topic to discuss.
Okay.
Yes, the last project that we collaborated on, Arts and Culture Task Force. So people already know that there was a complete cut of arts and culture in Philadelphia last year. So there was a big uproar. I already had interviews on this topic with David O, and I had an interview with Ciara Lambert. So you're gonna provide like a third perspective on this situation. So how you find out, how you've been involved in this?
I found out about the task force because I was invited to join the task force. I was recommended because of my knowledge of the arts and culture sector, specifically the smaller arts organizations who were extremely impacted. I would say individual artists and small organizations, small businesses were the ones that were immediately impacted by the pandemic, the shutdown orders, and the zeroing out of the arts and culture budget. And so I also was nominated because I was part of a group called the Philadelphia Assembly. We're an emerging organization that was convened by Art Place America in 2019 to be a means for which placekeepers, people who are doing the work in order to make sure that arts and culture receives the kind of acknowledgement, also the types of resources that are needed. That can be as practicing artists, but that could also be in community development. That could also be in those that connect the arts to other types of industries to make sure that the voices of an authentic arts community is heard in Philadelphia.
Mhm.
And so I was interviewed by staff people from Council Member Isaiah Thomas's office.
Mhm.
Sweating a little bit, but I was really honored to be invited and then to actually be part of the work.
Mhm.
So that's how I came into the task force.
Okay, yeah, and Sierra was like giving a very interesting perspective of how task force operated. What was, you know, I know you were an active part. So
Mm.
what do you think went right? What do you think went wrong? What do you think could be better?
So I listened to part of your interview with David O, and he said that the task force is the way to make people think that the work is getting done when nothing is getting done. That is not true, at least not in our case. You know, there was really the task force is part of a movement that's already been happening, right? So before the task force was in place, there were other groups talking about how the city has not had an equitable, the city has never fully invested in arts and culture, right? David O quoted what our industry brings to the city, right? We bring people to our establishments. We bring people to the city because of the small arts and culture, all those little theater houses, not, yes, the Arden, yes, you know, like the Suzanne Roberts Theater, but you also have like the smaller theater groups, like you've got your Pig Irons, you have your Beacon Street Theater, you have Theater in the X, you have the Lantern, you have all of these other groups that are bringing people into the city, but also animating the residents of Philadelphia, right? So like their presence is important. And so there was a lot of energy already, just kind of dissatisfaction with how the city has not truly invested, one, in the cultural fund, which is the means by which a majority of organizations get funded. Not everybody, but the majority of organizations.
Pretty much the only known fund for
that's immediately accessible, right? Then you've got the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, who works through the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, which also trickles out grants to individuals as well. But that's not enough. When we understand all of the artistic prowess that is in this city, Philadelphia is an incubator for individual artists and for organized artists, right? So there's been a long-standing discontent about how the city will talk about how great its arts scene is, but won't directly invest in us. And we're already bringing in all that money, right? So the task force was essentially collecting these stories that already existed. We were talking to people on the ground. We were articulating the frustrations, but also the solutions that were coming from the people on the ground. And our role was to put together different ideas that the city could then use in order to actualize ways to fix some of the problems, or at least provide like stopgaps. And stopgaps are not solutions, but this is what we can do in the moment right now. Let's continue talking and see
like
what
innovation
later.
Illumination grant.
Illuminate the Arts was inspired by the task force. We did not create it, but the information that we were bringing back to these meetings signified how important stimulus was. I was part of the permanence committee. Our focus is to make sure that arts and culture is on the radar forever of city government, right? The arts vote. Voting is not enough. There's got to be another way besides the amount of money that we bring in that we can demonstrate how important arts and culture is. And our theory within permanence hit on all the other aspects of the task force, right? So individual artists and small businesses, you can't have an art scene without individual artists, right? Youth and education. We talked about innovation earlier. Every single employer needs an employee who is a creative thinker. Whatever role you put them into, when a problem starts, you need somebody that's going to be able to solve the problem and keep things flowing. Arts and culture from a young age develops that type of thinking, right? And so we're thinking about what this means to make sure that arts and culture is accessible from the beginning. There was also nightlife, and thinking about governance. Where does nightlife live, right? So the nightlife team came up with the idea of the nighttime mayor, which exists in other cities and other countries. So a lot of the ideas that we, all of us, not just in permanence, put forth were modeled by other cities or other countries, right? So there was work being done. Just looking at Hurricane Harvey, some of the members of the Permanence Task Force met with the chief cultural officers for New York and New York City, and I think Houston. And we learned that during Hurricane Harvey, they had created, or it was before Hurricane Harvey, they created an artists relief fund. Oh, it was during Hurricane Harvey that it happened. So they created an artist relief fund that was able to send stimulus dollars to artists who were impacted by the winds, the damage, the flooding, so that when the coronavirus hit, the infrastructure was already there and artists were being supported immediately, right? New York had a different program that they were working on. I didn't get to attend that meeting, but it really inspired my teammates on the Permanence Committee to make some of the suggestions that they did in our report. So the report was published in March 2021. We had to write that thing in 2 weeks.
I remember.
Right? So what went right? What went right was the fact that we understood our role in the arc of this moment, right? We needed to take all of the inspiration, all of the energy that had come before us, claim it, like acknowledge it, not say that this stuff started with us. We are continuing the work of other people. The research that we did, we came up with some, I think, really good ideas that could be actionable. And some of those things have already come into play. The Illuminate the Arts was an idea because we were talking about stimulus. You know, some of the other ideas out there, which is using pilots, so payments in lieu of taxes. Right now, the University of Pennsylvania, this is not an idea that we came up with, but it's one that we think could be used for arts and culture, where the University of Pennsylvania, instead of being a 501c3, therefore it doesn't pay taxes, that money that they are making, they invest it into the immediate community. That money can be used to remove asbestos from schools. It can be used in order to develop neighborhoods for the residents that are there, not so that they're displaced, so that they can stay there. So these are things that are actively being talked about by city council. Some of us watched those hearings. We were doing research on the ideas that city council were interested in. So imagine if the organizations that are dedicated to arts education, PAFA, which is the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Moore College of Arts, one of the only all-female higher education art programs in the country. What about University of the Arts, right? What if those institutions that create artists contributed to them staying in the city, or contributed to the growing of other artists in elementary school, middle school, high school, life after, you finish your program? So, those were some of the ideas that we came up with. I think the thing that didn't go right was the amount of time that we had, but we understand sometimes government is like, do it or, so we did it.
Listen, music task force had 2 years to prepare.
2 years? We had 2 weeks in a pandemic working as volunteers, but that's how passionate we were about it. I think another thing though was political education. I think a lot of us are idealists, some of us are realists, and some of us are cynics. And to have that kind of cocktail, I think was really important. But I feel like more education on actually how like the budgeting process works. When the budgeting process works, there are a series of days that you have for testimony. How does testimony work? You know, just those kind of logistics, right? So that we would have been able to organize in a more effective way. I'm not going to say that we were stymied, but it did not feel as though we were encouraged to succeed, is what I would say.
That's what I felt when I was watching this.
You felt that too?
Exactly. Exactly, yes. I was watching testimony, especially by Ciara and Jason, and I didn't feel that they were really prepared.
Who's Jason? Raheem?
No, Raheem, I'm sorry, yes.
Okay.
Raheem, yes. I didn't feel like they were prepared or they actually receive appropriate training how to do it.
But I'm gonna tell you what, they let us. They made sure that whatever information they got, they tried to get it to us as quickly as we could. And I think we each brought our own types of personalities and our own types of like learning to the table. And we tried our best to support each other while we did feel that we didn't get a lot of information. And I think Council Member Thomas's team did the work that they could to help us. And he's also a new guy on the block. I think that was a fresh team. And they were highly ambitious for such a young council staff to get us to that point. We have the education now.
Right. So what's next?
That's a good question. So here's another part of the things that it's still a learning curve for us because we are affiliated with city government. Who is considered a task force member were the people who are officially invited. All the members that were part of our volunteer teams were subcommittee members, but not officially, you know, considered task force members. So now we're trying to keep the momentum going and pull those people in officially. But it means that I think we have to like disband. We have to officially dissolve as a task force and come back as something else.
Okay.
In order for us to do the work that many of us felt we could not do because we were so closely tied to 2 council offices, right? So certain kinds of advocacy we couldn't do, or they could not educate us on. Certain kinds of organizing we couldn't do because we were the task force. But that doesn't mean that our subcommittee members couldn't do this work, right?
Yeah, and they actually did.
Right? So that's the kind of learning that we've gained. And so I think the next step is the official dissolution. And in the meantime, it's the organizing and networking of bringing other voices in. I think one of the strengths was understanding that there were voices missing. And that's why we had subcommittee members, right? So now we know who these people are. Who else could we bring to the table in order to strengthen, you know, future advocacy? But I don't know what's officially next, but I do know that there is a lot of eagerness to continue the work in a deeper way.
Okay, Michelle, on this very positive note, we'll start recording. Thank you so much for your conversation, but don't leave. I do have a couple of quick questions for you off air.
Okay.
Okay.